Ah, yes, finally it's working. Beautiful. You guys have no idea how many times I just tested this to make sure it was working, and it turns out my volume was on mute, so I didn't know if my microphone was working. Welcome, guys, to your first edition of Mr. Saul Talking. I call these videos Mr. Saul Talking because one, I talk about myself in the third person a lot, two, I talk too much, and three, that's kind of just what these actually just end up being. It's just notes and me kind of talking. So I typically assign these so I can give you guys a some supplement to content when we're not meeting. So today, for about hopefully 10 minutes or so, I do want to talk about the successes and failures of the progressive movement and figure out just how progressive these progressives actually were. So there's going to be some video questions. There'll be three video questions, and you'll answer those on a separate Google Doc. If I can move forward, yeah, answer those on a separate Google Doc, and make sure that they are submitted by approximately 7:30 in the morning on Wednesday. Let me know if you guys need more time. If there's any problems that any of you may have, holler at me. You could just email that those questions to me if you have them. So let's get started. So today, hopefully in class, we talked about that reading that you guys did on Friday in regards to some of the goals of the progressive movement and what muckrakers were doing to expose some of the social ills of the late 1800s and early 1900s, trying to enact some changes. So, what exactly were the progressives successful in? I would say there's three kind of key things that you should think about. One, they're super successful in changing people's perception of what government is supposed to do. After the progressives, for the rest of American history, there's generally, although we can discuss today whether people still have this idea, but after the progressive movement, there's this sense that government should solve problems. And there were many problems as a result of industrialization and the Gilded Age. And for sure, people during the progressive era of the early 1900s realized that government at all levels, whether it's a local government or a state government, or obviously even the federal government, should be solving issues. And that's an important concept politically that we'll continue to talk about in the rest of the year. They get a lot of amendments passed, and you never see this kind of thing in American history, that essentially amendments are remarkably difficult to pass. We've only had 17 since the Bill of Rights. So, we only have 27 amendments. So to get four done in like a decade is pretty remarkable. But you have the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th. So all some are more important than others, but the 16th Amendment creates the income tax, and really that's designed to supplement revenue because the government is now solving issues. It's going to cost money to solve those issues, and a big proponent of raising money is the creation of the income tax. And boy, are there a lot of questions about the income tax and how it works. It's a complicated process, but hire a CPA. I don't know what to tell you. So CPA, by the way, is an accountant, by the way, guys. So, 17th Amendment, expansion of democracy. We have the direct election of senators, which I think people forget about. That prior to the 17th Amendment in 19, I believe, 13, um, state legislatures pick their senators. So people were even more removed from the process of having a say in the federal government. So the 17th Amendment expands democracy, allowing citizens, although we'll talk about which citizens, a right to vote for senators. You also have the 18th Amendment, which we'll talk way more about, which is prohibition. Doesn't go so well, as we will discuss soon. And then, of course, maybe the crowning achievement, the 19th Amendment, which guarantees the right to vote can't be abridged on account of sex, and very critical. It's the 100th year anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which we'll talk more about hopefully next week. So the large things that progressives are able to really do is in regards to the economy. So we talked a little about that hopefully today, but expanding that, you have the passage of antitrust laws, and trusts were again monopolies. So you have laws that strengthen the federal government's ability to stop monopolies from growing. The Department of Justice within the federal government, as a result of laws like the Clayton Antitrust Act, can now stop businesses and corporations from merging if the government thinks that they're going to grow too big. I mean, to give you an example, to this day, this is something that the federal government is concerned with when it comes to, let's say, Facebook buying Instagram, which it did, or concerns about TikTok and what company, whether or not, I think recently Oracle is going to buy TikTok. That needs to get approved through the Department of Justice. So it strengthens the ability in this era for the government to step in and prevent businesses from doing things that may be going to exploit people or create too much domination. You also have the Department of Labor that's created to protect workers' rights. You have the conservation of natural resources, the National Park Service is created, for example. Teddy Roosevelt, who's kind of like the ultimate progressive president in some ways. He is kind of the champion of this effort to conserve the country. And he even, goes on like long weeks of hiking in Yosemite, and he was a big advocate of that. You also have the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, and the FTC, which is established in 1914, watches over business practices, and to this day continues to watch over business practices. In fact, all of these things are still around. I mean, the 18th Amendment we'll talk about, it gets replaced by the 21st Amendment, but the Department of Labor we still have, the National Park Service we still have efforts to conserve, although some are arguing for in the Trump administration to tapping into those protected lands. The Federal Trade Commission still to this day is overseeing business practices to make sure businesses aren't doing anything that's too illegal or doing things like predatory pricing, which if you want me to go into detail with, you can ask me next class. But these are the major successes. So the key question I want to ask here is which one of these discussed you think has had the greatest impact on American society and American history in general? You can pause and answer that question now, or you can wait until the end and I run through the next brief topic and answer it then. So let's talk about these failures, because I think the progressives, obviously the name suggesting that they're progressive, they're trying to improve society. I think that it's important to remember that really the question comes down to improving society for who. To give you an idea of like where progressivism didn't work, I mean, prohibition may have arguably gone too far. As we'll talk about in the 20s, prohibition failed. Ultimately, obviously, the country decides to rectify that by passing the 21st Amendment, which we'll talk way more about. People argued that maybe it isn't the place of the government to tell people that they can't engage in certain activities like consume alcohol. Progressives, as we'll also talk about, while they passed the 19th Amendment and get women the right to vote, it's not like progressives smashed the patriarchy and were all feminists. That's just not the case. Job discrimination still was rampant against women. Sexism was still completely the norm within American society. And the most critical thing that we're going to talk about right now and in our next class on Wednesday is progressives were not for racial equality. The vast majority of middle-class white progressives not only didn't care about racial equality, some of them even promoted racism openly. There are many progressives who supported eugenics, which is this absolutely bonkers fake pseudoscience of trying to prove white supremacy. So, they would engage in ridiculous studies of skulls of different, races and try to figure out if there was genetic differences. And all this was disproven years later, but also the design of eugenics and this fake science was only to prove that somehow white people were better than anyone else, and namely black people, and that's why that black people should have been treated the way that they were. And this was openly supported by many progressive individuals. You also have progressive presidents, as we'll talk about in a second, who openly endorsed racism and supported racism. So how far did the progressive movement go really comes down to who was it benefiting. The important thing to remember about the progressive era in the early 1900s is that while it's improving life for many Americans, life was horrifying and terrifying in the U.S. South and in much of the country. And that's because white supremacy was codified. And by codified, that word just means put into law. So white supremacy was literally enshrined in law in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s. And that was through the creation of Jim Crow laws. So black codes, which hopefully you guys remember thinking about the Reconstruction era. Black codes, of course, were the earliest laws post-Civil War to denigrate Black people in America and kind of restrict them of the rights that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were designed to protect. And Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow was a minstrel show character that was an offensive stereotype of a enslaved person who was happy. And Jim Crow laws become really an umbrella. The term Jim Crow is an umbrella term to refer to any law passed in the U.S. South from about 1870-ish to 1968, at the end of the Civil Rights Movement, that was designed to deny Black equality and to essentially destroy any semblance of normalcy or economic opportunity for Black people. So that namely meant denying Black people the right to vote, so they couldn't have any political power. That meant separating facilities. That meant legally discriminating Black people from obtaining certain kinds of work, and denying Black people an opportunity to get education at any real level, but including obviously at a collegiate level. This wasn't the case everywhere. This is largely in the South. We'll talk about individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois on Wednesday, who in fact went to Harvard and was the first Black man to graduate Harvard with a graduate degree. But in the U.S. South and many northern states, even, there was essentially legal white supremacy. There was no prosecution of people who lynched Black people. I mean, hung Black people. There was no prosecution of people who just simply wanted to deny a Black person a job solely because of the color of their skin. And the craziest part of all this is that, like I'm saying, all of this was completely legal. In 1896, the Supreme Court hears a very important case called Plessy versus Ferguson, where essentially this man, Homer Plessy, who was 7/8 white but 1/8 Black, he purposely goes on a train car in Louisiana to sit in a section that's designed for whites, and he knows that he will be arrested for this. Think, yes, this is very similar to Rosa Parks, who we'll talk about in the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. But Homer Plessy is arrested, and they want this case to go to the Supreme Court for the court to finally make a determination on whether states can legally segregate people. And the court rules in 1896 that that states in the South are allowed to legally segregate people so long as they are, quote, separate but equal. So this is a ridiculous concept that will plague the United States up and through the 1950s and the Civil Rights Movement. And tragically, the Supreme Court rules that essentially it's okay to segregate people as long as the facilities that are being created, for example, like separate bathrooms or separate waiting rooms at a bus stop, as long as they're the same quality, which of course is ridiculous, because the whole goal of Jim Crow and the goal of many white supremacists in the South was not to create equality, but rather to treat Blacks as not even human beings. So this protected Jim Crow for decades into the future. And to give you an idea of like how progressive this era was, I know that I'm over 10 minutes, guys. I'm way over 10 minutes, but that's his life. President Wilson, who was a governor of New Jersey, but, very famously, he was a guy from Virginia. When he was president from 1913 to 1921, he was considered a champion progressive, but he not only segregated his own White House and openly support racism. He didn't even bother to care about passing laws that would have made lynching illegal federally. He very famously showed the movie The Birth of a Nation at the White House in 1915, which is a movie, very famous movie, that celebrated the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1860s, post-Civil War, 1860s, 1870s. In fact, the movie was so popular, it was like a massive, massive hit. It was so popular that it led, as we'll talk about, to the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 19-teens and 1920s. And that is just a crazy story in American history in which millions of white Americans joined the Klan, which is bonkers. And there's so much more to talk about, but I'll leave it there. So really, the last two questions, pretty straightforward. What were Jim Crow laws? How did they impact life for Black Americans? And we'll talk more about this on Wednesday. And lastly, do you think it's fair to argue that the positive stuff that we talked about, the positive successes, did those outweigh the failures, or is that a ridiculous argument to make? And you'd argue the opposite, that the failures outweighed the successes. Just one of those historically interesting questions. So really keep that question in mind, like progressives how actual progressive were these people? Was it a benefit of all to all Americans? Just giving you a quick, tidbit about your um, probable quiz prompt, you might be asked a question along these lines of to what extent the progressive movement was really all that great for all people. So anyway, I'll let you guys run. I've talked too long. We'll see each other soon.